G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Battlefield Guide for Matt McLaughlin, Battlefield Tours Pete Smith. And Pete has joined us today to talk about the AIF behind the lines during the Great War. Hi Pete, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi Adam, nice to be back.
Thank you, Pete. I really do appreciate you coming on, and we often talk about frontline fighting and what was going on in the trenches, but we don't seem to look, Pete, behind the lines. And when the soldiers were at the front line, they were in the fighting, and obviously, so what was happening behind the lines, Pete?
Well, there's an awful lot. Let's just have a think about our perception of the Great War, I suppose. I suppose, focus on the front line because that's really what the war is about. It's about fighting the Germans. It's about forcing them back, trying to get them out of France and Belgium. So that's where our focus tends to be, in that tiny strip of land that runs from the Channel to the Alps. And we just kind of zero in on that. I suppose it's also a fascination with horror. It's something that always holds people's minds. They tend to delve into the horror, how horrific it was. And we don't really think of that, all of that land behind, all of that land going to the coast from the British Empire sectors. Now, what was going on in that land behind? Well, it was absolutely heaving. And the other thing is that, again, we think that, and there is this romantic, horrific, I suppose, a bit of both, vision that a soldier arrived, especially if you imagine he came from Australia, he's been to Egypt, he may have been to Gallipoli, he comes to the Western Front, he goes into the front line, and he stays in that front line until either he's dead, he's wounded, or the war finishes. And of course, that's not the case at all. They are rotating in and out of the front line constantly. And they say a soldier's kind of life was 50-50 between the rear areas and the front line. But actually, it's not even as much as that, because when they go to the front, they're not always literally at the front in the front line. So you just need to think, right, there's this great swathe of land, what's going on behind? So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Why do you think we should share more stories about this part of the war, and what can they tell us about what was happening behind the scenes?
Well, it's about the soldiers' lives, really. If we're trying to learn about a soldier and what he did in that period, 1914, 1918, then yes, we know about the battles, we know about the deaths. There's another reason as well, of course, is because when a soldier was wounded, when he was killed, then it generates paperwork, and we can see that. We can see the documentation. What we can't see is when he was going on local leave, when he was just given a day off to go to the nearest town. We can't see, or we don't really learn about his leave. What did he do when he had his 10 days off, if he's lucky enough to get 10 days off? What happened when he's training? Because, of course, coming to the Western Front and just fighting until, as I said, you die, you win, or the war ends, then that's, again, not the case, because tactics are changing. Constantly new weaponry is coming in, and those men have to be trained in the new weaponry, the new tactics, so they're coming out of the line and behind the lines to learn about that. So there needs to be a landscape. There needs to be a landscape that is both for soldiers to rest, it's for soldiers to learn, and the other thing, of course, is for casualties to recuperate, those that are not going to go on the journey across the seas back to Britain, and perhaps even further home if they are no longer able to fight. So all of this is going on behind the lines.
So, Pete, can you share with us how long troops generally stayed at the front lines before they were actually rotated out?
That's a little bit like how long is a piece of string. And in fact, I just thought I'd try and go online before I knew you were going to ask me that question, so everybody generally does. So I went online just to see, generally speaking, what the online opinion was from various articles, and the overall answer is it's different. It's so variable depending on conditions. So that's the first one, weather conditions. If it's icy, freezing cold weather, as it was around where I am at the moment, Flare, on the Somme battlefield, then here it's when the Australians held the front line in the winter. Well, they dropped it to a day. Men were only coming in for a day and then coming out the line, because it was taking so long to get out the line. It was taking another day to get out the line. But the conditions were appalling, and men were dropping like flies with hypothermia and frostbite and trench foot. So that's one of the things that can affect it. The other thing is, again, I suppose it's the ease and difficulty. If you're very much overlooked, then men tended to be a little longer in the line because they would lose men in trying to get in and out of the line. In other words, the Germans could see what was going on, so they would not rotate them quite as often. So it's conditions, it's weather, it's manpower. If there's lots of men and there's a lot of guys, then you feel like you can rotate them a little bit quicker. So I always say the average 3 days in the front line, perhaps 3 days in reserve and 3 days rest, and then a full rotation. So maybe 9 days, 6 days. It varies, as for all of those reasons I've just explained. But the men are not in the line for months on end. I mean, sadly, there are occasions when they're in the line for a very long time because they can't be relieved because there's nobody to relieve them. So again, that alters if you're looking at statistics, that alters the statistics. But I generally say 3 days front line, 3 days reserve, 3 day rest.
So, Pete, can you tell us the difference, and for people who aren't aware, there was leave behind the lines and then there was blighty leave. So can you tell us about the two differences in those types of leave?
Well, it's interesting, Adam, isn't it, that the local leave, and that's what I tend to call it, i.e. leave that's local to wherever you happen to be based, is not mentioned because it doesn't appear in a service file. I'm very lucky for Australians. You have access to the service files of the soldiers. For a lot of Brits, that they don't exist. But you can see leave. You can see when the soldiers are going on leave. And for an Australian, he's got the choice really of Paris or London. And if he's going to London, then that effectively doesn't mean London. It means anywhere in the UK that he wants to go to. For Paris leave, it generally means Paris. You're going to Paris. You have to say the bulk of the men tended to go to London because a lot of Australians had relatives in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. But if you're on local leave, then it can be perhaps an overnight stay somewhere. It can be just a day out. And my grandfather, who fought on the Great War, in his diary, I've got a little comment on one of his diary entries, and it's borrowed the skipper's cycle to go to Amiens. So he was near enough. He was in the divisional ammunition column, so never right in the front line. But he managed to get a bit of time off, and he jumped on his skipper's bike and went into Amiens for something to eat. He must have done more than eating because later on in the diary it says forgot skipper's bike. So he obviously had a few beers and something, and managed to hitch his ride back to wherever he was based, and he forgot his boss's cycle, so he had to go in the following day to go and get his bike.
He wouldn't have.
So yeah.
Sorry, Pete. Go.
No. So local leave is fascinating in the sense that it's not recorded. So you need to rely on little diary entries like my grandfather's entry of where they were going. Sometimes it was only to the next village, to the village behind the lines, and you are very much aware that soldiers needed human companionship. I'm not necessarily meaning of a sexual nature. They just needed somebody to talk to sometimes, preferably a female who they could just kind of forget about the war for a while. So very many men set up kind of relationships with families, and they would try and get back to a family home behind the lines, not necessarily always a long way behind the lines, but far enough where there was an element of safety, and they could perhaps sleep on the kitchen floor with a warm fire, having had a meal and a chat and perhaps a beer with the family. And sometimes they even got a bed. I have to say, beds tend to be reserved for officers, but the men sometimes got a bed as well, especially if they got to know the family very well. So it's one of those nicer aspects that we just don't think about, that relationship between the soldiers and local families who they just got that little bit of home comfort from them.
We often talk, and the soldiers visited some of the local places behind the lines. And what did the locals think of the men fighting and coming behind the lines into their villages? What was their general opinion of the soldiers?
Another very good question, because it's very hard to answer again, because it varies to such an extent, and we get all sorts of stories of where the villagers certainly did dislike them, and didn't like these gruff, kind of rough, toughy guys who swore a lot and didn't understand their language or their customs and didn't follow the rules. So there were certainly problems in some areas. In other areas, of course, there's something else that the guys are going to do which endeared them to the local population, and that is they're going to spend their money. And that helps. You have to say it helps, because they didn't always go to restaurants or cafes or anything. Almost any farmer's wife who could knock up a load of eggs and ham or whatever she had. I suppose frites, pommes frites, and oof eggs with a major stable, and it was hot, and it was not what you got in the front line, and so that helped with relationships as well. But you do have some kind of fairly awful tales that I've read and heard over the years. I remember one about where the local people locked the wells so that the soldiers couldn't even fill their water bottles from the wells because they felt like that was their water, and why were these guys coming in and just using their wells? So there were problems in some areas. In other areas, no problems at all. And of course, language was always going to be a problem, as it is for me even now, having been here nearly 18 years. It's still a problem. So language is always going to be a problem. But I think part of the fun of going to a foreign country is that experience of trying to learn a foreign language, perhaps, from my point of view.
Before the war, the soldiers had, many of them hadn't been overseas or left their home country, and most soldiers thought it was a grand adventure and a rare opportunity to visit foreign places. For those who could, when they weren't at the front, were the soldiers visiting tourist places, and how did they act as tourists being out of the line?
Yeah, it's an interesting question again, Adam, because of course it's multiple answers. Some guys found, and you have to remember, I suppose the thing I should really emphasise is there are frontline troops and there are rear echelon troops, and there are a lot more rear echelon troops, guys involved in the transport and the ammunition and everything else, the food and the movements, than there are almost frontline troops. So there's an awful lot of men who are, how can I put it? They're enjoying the war. They're not expected to go near the front line, or very rarely go near the front line. They're getting that interaction with the local population. Perhaps they're missing home, but they know it's not going to be forever. Or hopefully it's not going to be forever. And so there was more of an interaction there. There was more time to visit places behind the lines. There's not that destruction, because remember what we've got is a belt of destruction where you have to go at least 10 kilometers. Sometimes further, to get out of that area where you're in danger of long-range shelling or where the buildings have been damaged, if you really want to have a look at some rural France and some proper tourist attractions, and we'll come back to what they would visit. So I think, yeah, it's various. But let's first of all think of a frontline man. If you're not traumatized, and of course a lot of these guys were, all they wanted was to drink and to womanize, because they felt that that's what they needed. And that's what a lot of it's about. What do you need? If you've been in these terrible conditions, you need to forget about it. So let's find a woman and let's drink myself into oblivion. And of course, that didn't always endear them to the local population. And there were other soldiers who felt, no, to get it out of their system, what they needed to do was to see something, was to actually to do something. And so, yes, there were sites they could go to, and perhaps the most famous ones in this area, certainly heading towards Amiens, which is the nearest big city. Amiens got a cathedral, and the cathedral had been damaged a little. But there's also something else going on here as well, you have to say, and that is religion. And that is that some of the soldiers were religious, and those that perhaps weren't religious perhaps thought maybe they ought to be, because that could give them a better chance of surviving. So you do find that there's a lot of people who maybe started off not quite so religious, who then cling to religion as a way of trying to get themselves through this experience. Equally, there were men that lost their religions completely. So again, both sides of the coin. But Amiens Cathedral became a favourite place for guys to go and see, because it's beautiful, as we do now. If you're on tour in this area on the First World War tour, then we always try and fit in a little bit of behind the lines, and we'll go and have a look at Amiens Cathedral. It's a fantastic place. I'm a collector of Great War memorabilia, and I've actually got a little leaflet produced in 1917, and it was by a British padre, and it's a guide to the cathedral in English, so that you could buy it for a few pennies, coffers into his religious pot, and you could have a look around the cathedral. So the cathedral being one. The other one that I just think of instantly, of course, is those caves at Nahor. The underground caves at Nahor, where soldiers could. It's an underground city. It's often described that. In fact, it was a shelter for people during the 100 Years' War. and the 30 Years' War, and in fact any war. It became a shelter for people to hide in beside this village of Naor, and it's open to the public now, and it was open to the public during the Great War period, and certainly soldiers went there. They scratched their or wrote their names on the walls. And again, you have to say there's a double whammy going on here. It's also a religious site. It's got some religious effigies and carvings and a little chapel underground there. And so soldiers are going under there to go and look at these things and write their names, so leave a bit of themselves in these underground chambers and then back off to the front. So there were certainly places to go and look at that were organised for the soldiers. And of course, the final one would be to the coast. If you can get enough time and you've got a local leave, or in fact your whole division has been taken out the line for rest and it's been taken close to the coast, which quite often they were, then the lorries would load up people and they go on swimming parties down to the beach to go swimming. So there was lots of things to occupy, or perhaps not lots, but there was enough to occupy people if they were interested in finding that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and so some of the families are lucky enough to have photos of their relatives visiting various places. How important do you think this was for their families to see, and were the photos another way for the men to reassure their families that they were okay?
Yeah, I think you've got again. Different soldiers have different ideas of why they went to photographers to have their photographs taken. So the first thing to say, where would you go? Well, there were enterprising men Frenchmen, who had a camera and a studio, and this time this is because it's glass plate, so it's not the easiest thing to develop. It's not like our modern digital cameras. So, and they would come as close as they could to the front. And so these guys were not even out of the danger area. These guys are behind the lines, either moving up to the front line, coming out to the front line, and they could pop into a photographer and have their photograph taken. So you have to say, to a mother receiving a photo of her son looking tired, dirty, exhausted, is that perhaps something that she would want to see? So I would have to say that I think a lot of the photographs that were taken in the front line, were the men themselves wanting a record for themselves to take home of what they'd done and how they looked. So I think there's an element of that going on to start off with. These really aren't for other people. They may be for other people if they survive and they go home. These are really for them to take home as an aide memoir to what went on, along with their little diaries. Now, further back in places like Amiens and further back the towns and villages all the way to the coast, then you get professional studios taking photographs with proper backdrops and as you would have had at home in Australia or in somewhere in the UK. And I think those were the ones that were more likely to be sent home to mother. I'm behind the lines. Look how smart I am. This is me and my pals occasionally, and I'm going to. I'll send that home. So I think there were two types of photographs taken: one for the men themselves, and perhaps one for mother, which was seen as a good photo to have taken. And certainly, most soldiers did. I collect those photographs that they had taken. I've got a nice example. Sadly, most of them it's Fred and Jim and Bill, so we'll never know who they are. So I often describe them as my men, because that's all they'll ever be is Fred, Jim, and Bill. We've lost the information as to who they are. But I look at those very often smiling, sometimes serious faces, and we do remember them. For that reason, I remember them, and very often people come along and borrow my photographs to put into books and things, and so they are remembered because those photographs exist. So you have to say, to a certain extent, what they were trying to do, which was leave something of themselves on earth by having these photographs taken, has worked.
Absolutely, and I think it's a key point that you touch on there, Pete. I think it's one of the things that's overlooked.
Well, it is, and of course now perhaps not as much, because there's a little museum that's opened up in. I've forgotten the name of it now. It shows you I haven't been guiding for a while because of COVID. I can't actually remember the name of the place. But there's a little museum. It'll come to me in a second while we're talking. A little museum that's opened up that now shows one of these photographers. They found the glass plates and they've developed them, and you can now go and actually look at where his studio would have been, just behind the lines. In this case, it's quite a way behind the lines, taking the photographs. So yeah, it's again, it's something that's more and more research has gone into in recent years.
Absolutely, and it's a fascinating. I've been to that museum, Pete, and it's like stepping back in time. It really is.
Yeah, it is. What is it called? It comes to me in a minute.
I can't remember myself, Pete. I'm sitting here struggling too. So, but it's great, isn't it? And
Yeah,
it'll
it
come
is.
to
Yeah,
us when we don't need
yeah.
it. Yeah. So, untold numbers of men suffered from shell shock after witnessing and experiencing the horrors of war on a daily basis. Do you think this encouraged the leaders to rotate troops behind the lines more often so they could recover and go back into the line?
Um, yes and no. So let's talk about the different types of what we would have known as a shell shock. So literally, shell shock, that term came about because of the belief that men's brains were being rattled with inside their skulls from the concussion of shells that altered them, that changed them, that made them terrified. It made them shake. It made them have the tremors. It made them run away. It made them not know what it made. I mean, there were so many effects, and that was part of the problem that the military had. How the heck can we tell what is real and what is a soldier? Let's use a term that they would have used in the First World War, a malingerer. What is he making it up? Has he seen people with genuine shell shock and thinks, I can reproduce that? I can probably do that, and it might get me out the front line. So that was one of the issues. The second issue is that some of the guys had, as we would now know, PTSD. So they hadn't had their brains rattled. They'd just seen too much. They'd just done too much. So it wasn't about a physical effect from concussion affecting your head and your brain. It was just literally, as we now know, PTSD. So there was a big problem in how do you deal with all of this? Is rotation going to help? But of course, all those things are a luxury. If you've got enough men to be able to rotate, if you can take people out the lines that look like they're going wobbly, and that's what they tended to do. What they would do, if you had a good senior NCO, a good officer, and he could spot a guy who was potentially having problems, and that's you could see them. These guys that would perhaps twitch too much, would just be not looking quite right. And what you would do is you would rest them, so they would be taken as individuals, not as a whole unit. As an individual, if you had a good NCO, a good officer, he would say that bloke needs to go with the transport for the next month. He needs to go on a bombing course, not because we need him to be trained as a bomber, perhaps. I mean, it will be helpful, but what we do, we need him out the front line for a while. And so men were taken out for rest. Some were taken right out and went back to become instructors in the UK, in Britain. So they were removed and used as instructors and will return, as most of them will eventually. And some of them to very successful careers. So they cured their issues that they had, and that rest did exactly what it was supposed to do. But there was no real, I don't think we have that thinking where we're going to take a whole division and rest them for longer because we feel that they've done too much. I don't think they ever had that luxury. We were always stretched for men all the time during the Great War. So I think it was more a case of people being taken out the line and rested as individuals when you could see that they were having a problem. Of course, some units didn't do it. There was nobody in that unit that really very cruelly gave a damn. And if you went wobbly, you went wobbly, and you either got to get over it, or sadly you're going to run away and you're going to get yourself into big trouble, and of course occasionally executed if you're in the British Army. Not so in the Australian Army, because they did not carry out capital punishment. Even though I just must state this, even though Australia did sentence them to death, they were court-martialed and sentenced to death, but it was then commuted to a period of imprisonment.
Well,
Imprisonment,
that's a big difference there, Pete. I didn't know that, actually. So that's a very key point to touch on. So and I guess, Pete, in a way, it could, I guess, the PTSD that we now know, it would also back then would have been seen as cowardice, wouldn't it? That was the form of cowardice.
Well, I think that's the key. If I mean, they had rudimentary, and they are very rudimentary trials and tribunals, and if it was seen that there really was no reason other than you didn't like it, then that is cowardice. But how do you tell? How on earth do you tell that from a guy who's just done too much? And we know there's some absolute travesties of justice in some of those that were executed. But sadly, sometimes the driving force is if there's a lot of problems in that battalion, in that brigade, in that division, and they feel they need a bit of a stiffener, let's execute a few, and that should show what's going to happen if you run away, or you try to run away, or you don't do your duty. And if that was the case, then of course, then you're doomed. The other thing is almost complacency. Quite often, because this has to go through several ranks, it goes higher and higher for a court-martial. And at each level, somebody's got to sign it off and say, yes, I think he should be shot. But very often they put, yes, I think they should be shot, but I recommend leniency. But that's not good enough, because that then is passing the buck. That takes it up to the next man, who then does the same and takes it up to the next man, and eventually it ends upon whoever it is who's going to make that final decision. He just shot, stamped, and they're executed, much to everybody's surprise. But that really is because nobody kind of bit the bullet lower down and said, no, this should not happen. This guy needs help. It's very rare in the First World War, you have to say.
Absolutely, and it's just come to me, Pete, that do we actually know, it's probably a hard question for you to answer, do we actually know how many British soldiers were shot in the war?
Yes, we do. Have I got that information in front of me? No, I haven't. So yes, we do. I mean, it's been very, very well studied in recent years, and certainly as we led up to the pardon, because all of those executed in the First World War were pardoned in Britain. So as that gathered momentum, then more and more research was done on those that had been executed. So no, there's an awful lot of books out there now on the men. All the figures are well known. And I have to say, and I think I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, may not have been yours, Adam, but certainly in a podcast, I talked about it, that at the National Arboretum in Britain, which is fairly much in the centre of the country, not that far from Nottingham, I can't remember exactly where it is, but near Nottingham, I think. At the Arboretum there, a great big wood. They're developing war memorials. The National Memorial for Modern Warfare is there, but there's one other memorials all around it, and there's one for those shot at dawn, and it's absolutely visual, horrific memorial in a way, because it's a shooting post with a soldier tied to it, and that's carved in stone, blindfolded, tied to his shooting post. But all around him are more and more posts, and there's a post for every single soldier that was executed in the First World War, so we do know exactly how many. And so when you look at it, it's very visual. You can see this one guy in the centre tied to a post, and then surrounding him are all of the other posts that representing all of those that were executed. It's a very, if you're of an emotional disposition, then it is guaranteed to get you upset, because it is very, very visual. And I think a stunning memorial.
Absolutely. And probably one of the better memorials, Pete, that some that we won't mention that are popping up on the Western Front.
Indeed, yeah, and in fact, I think there's a podcast there, horrible memorials of the Western Front. But anyway,
I think so. Yeah, no, I agree, Pete. I think so. In my very first podcast episode, I talked about Talbot House, the Everyman's Club, which was set up in 1915 in Poppering. And so, how important were places like this for men? And do you know of any similar places that existed on the Western Front apart from Talbot House?
They were everywhere. Adam. Absolutely everywhere. The problem is majority of them were in huts, so they're not permanent. They're not a purchased house, a house that is going to be bought and is going to be used for that very specific purpose. In fact, going back to my postcard collection, I actually have a picture of the Salvation Army house in Poppering as well, because that one we've just been discussing, Toc H, is in Poppering. Well, the Salvation Army also had a house doing exactly the same thing in Poppering as well. So there were lots of buildings and houses that were rented, that were used, but an awful lot of huts, because a lot of the camps were huts. And if you're going to be close to where the men are, if you're going to offer them, well, you have to say there's an element of religion, as there is in Toc H. It's a mix of religion and rest and tea, and books and place where you can write letters. That's the other thing that they always offer, a place you can sit down, clean, dry, and you can write a letter. And of course, Toc H famous because there's also accommodation there. So they're everywhere. They're in the huts. I scribbled down earlier because, again, I suspected you may ask me this question. So I've got Salvation Army, Church Army huts, YMCA, and then canteens, because divisions also had canteens. Now, these would sell alcohol, but they're still rest areas. They're rest areas for the men to sit down and to be able to write. There are others. There are a lot of others. So, and in fact, again, on the wall outside my house here, I have an old YMCA sign that was salvaged off a building here. YMCA were everywhere, setting up for, again, a religious organisation. They even wore a semi-military uniform with a triangular badge on their arms with YMCA, and some were killed. In fact, in the rear areas, some were killed by long-range shelling, but an awful lot died in the very, very topical, in the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919. So you'll see the graves of these strange badges on them. You're thinking, what on earth is that? And it's some canteen or YMCA, and it's the guys that were working in these that died in these epidemics. So yes, there were lots of places to go to simply answer your question, and they were important. They were important places, especially for that letter writing. Something we haven't mentioned. When you came out the line, what you really want to do is tell your relative that you're out the line and you're well. So letter writing was a very important aspect of the Western Front. And just to give you an idea, you write a letter in the Western Front behind the lines, you put it in the post, 2 days later it will be in the UK. Of course, it's a bit different for those around the Empire, but for in the UK, 2 days. It takes 4 days nowadays, so it was faster in the First World War than the. I think we've mentioned this before, actually, Adam, but it's important. It's a good thing to reiterate. The postal system was very good.
Absolutely. So, what were some of the essential tasks that had to be undertaken when behind the lines and not in active fighting? So, was there trench maintenance? Was there what were they doing, Pete?
The list as long as your arm. And so you have to think of everything that a soldier needs to be in the front line, everything that is needed to keep him there. So there's transport. Well, if you've got transport, that means somebody's got to repair that transport and keep it in good nick. If you've got food, then somebody's got to organise the movement of that food using that transport. I mean, later on in the war, they even had farms up on the coast. So you had enormous piggeries producing the pork in France. It was just, well, why we bring it in from elsewhere when we can feed the pigs with some of the slops from the army, and we can have piggeries. Cleaning. When you think of all these guys coming out the line with dirty uniforms, well, they didn't wear the same uniform month in, month out. Well, in some cases they did, but at some point their uniform would be cleaned and they would be issued with a new one or repaired. It would be repaired. So there were droves of women, sometimes local women, sometimes women that were remembering that there are lots of refugees from places like Belgium who are in camps. So some of those picked up jobs cleaning equipment and clothing. Of course, salvage. There is this massive need as the war goes on for salvage. So there are enormous great salvage dumps behind the lines. Well, it's all right salvaging something, but then it's got to be either reused or it's got to go back to the UK to be melted down. So there's all that going on. The other thing, of course, we mentioned that the soldiers would go to sites, so they'd go to cathedrals, they'd go and have their photographs taken, but there were also theatres and cinemas behind the lines. So we have those as well. And we haven't even touched upon the medical, which is absolutely enormous, because there were guys getting flu, and I don't mean Spanish flu, I just mean flu and influenza and stomach bugs, which are not life-threatening, but they certainly mean that you cannot be a good soldier. So you were taken out and fed up or rested and then put back in the line again. So there are rest centres and hospitals right the way to the coast. And then there's these reserve training areas. You quite rightly said, were there trenches and things? So yes, there were. There were mock-up trenches. There were big, great training areas. So no, if you can think of it, then for a city that needs to be kept going, then rail networks, roads, people improving the roads, the railways. It's all about movement. A lot of it is about movement of people in and out of the front line. But for all of those people, they've got to be watered, they've got to be fed, they've got to be kept moving. So yeah, it's enormous behind the lines. And some of those little towns and cities, it's something we don't think about. There's one that I always look at because it's so dead now. It is a dead little French town, and it's called Oxy-le-Château. And I love it because you go there. It's not changed. It is almost exactly as it was during the First World War. It's far enough out of any kind of firing line. It didn't ever get damaged. It's never grown. It's remained the same. And you have to say, I look at that town and I think the busiest it must have ever been in the whole history of that town is in 1418, because it was heaving. There were aerodromes close by. Again, something we haven't mentioned. Aerodromes close by. There were big supply dumps. There were training areas. There were medical facilities. Just enormous. So much going on behind the lines.
Absolutely, and I think that's why it's fascinating, Pete, to talk about behind the lines activities, to just step away from the frontline fighting, and it's a fascinating topic, and it was something that drew me in. I wanted to learn more about what the troops were doing behind the lines.
Well, what's interesting, Adam, I suppose, as well, is in the front line, there's nothing really left of the soldiers that were here. There's nothing to show you because the buildings were destroyed, the farming ploughed back in the trenches. So there's very, very little here. The houses have all been rebuilt. My village is not a stone left from before the First World War. So there's nothing, if you didn't know, apart from the cemeteries and the odd memorial, there's nothing here to show you that the war was ever here. That's not the same behind the lines, because the soldiers scratched their names into walls. They wrote their signs on buildings. There's a little theatre. There's the remnants of a theatre in an old barn just behind the lines between here and the coast. So there's a lot more left, funnily and oddly enough, behind the lines than there is in the front line, where the soldiers did all the fighting. So it's very interesting to go behind the lines. And in fact, I've got little projects going on with a friend of mine. And every time we go to a village that we haven't visited before, we go and look at the church. Not because we're religious, not because we're even really interested in the church. It's because the churches were mainly built out of soft limestone or chalk. Very easy to scratch your name into. And so we go around looking for First World War graffiti on the walls of the churches. And quite often we find it. We find the names of soldiers and their regimental numbers scratched into the walls of the churches.
Absolutely, it's just fascinating, Pete. Just talking, like, it's just fascinating hearing the stories of what's left, and because, Pete, you're a battlefield historian. You've walked the ground hundreds, thousands of times, and now when you go to the Western Front, there's not much of the front line. There's only really one place that you can really see remnants of trenches on the Western Front, because a lot of it has been turned back to farming. It's all rolling countryside, and you're right. There's not a lot of evidence left of the trenches of the First World War.
No, there isn't. And so it's something that I think over the years has been developed more and more, or has come to people's attention, that yes, we're all interested in the fighting. Yes, we're all interested in what went on in the front line. And yes, we all like kind of using our minds to envisage what it was like. But actually, you don't have to do that so much if you go behind the lines, because a lot of the villages, just in this area of France, it's very, very rural, and the populations have decreased rather than increased in a lot of these villages, and they just haven't changed. They are exactly the same as they were in the Great War. So it does give you a little bit more of an insight. And one, I think that is nice to get a juxtaposition of the front line, just what we're talking about, a juxtaposition between the front line and the rear areas.
Absolutely. So possibly the most dangerous places behind the lines were the casualty clearing stations. Can you tell us a little bit about the casualty clearing stations, and what was their main responsibilities, and how were men taken to them and then evacuated from them?
Well, you would have to say casualty clearing stations, I would not really class them in most cases as behind the lines. They are part of the front line in a way. An immediate casualty clearing station it is behind the lines, but it's not what we've been talking about. What we're really talking about today is a lot further behind the lines rather than just a couple of 100 meters, because a casualty clearing station can be that. It can be a couple of 100 meters, it can be a couple of kilometers, but it's normally very, 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 very close. Having said that, of course, there are some further back that are part of the rail networks. So a good one, I'm just trying to think of two here. The two that come to mind, I suppose, immediately would be Listenhoek in Belgium, which is that's more of a field hospital, really. In fact, it is a field hospital, so it's a bit more than the casualty clearing, but that is beyond the range of artillery fire for most of the war. Just very towards the end of the war in 1918, it came under direct fire, but bombing, perhaps a little bit of bombing, but it's far enough behind where you can actually build a proper field hospital. A little bit closer would be one that's close to here, and that is called what is it called? Sometimes you wish you hadn't started the conversation, but anyway, it's on the rail network. Healy Station, got it. Healy Station. So Healy Station, just behind the lines here, a few kilometres away, perhaps 5-10 kilometres away, just outside of the range of the shelling for most of the war. And again, it's where the large trains could come to. And so these places always have big cemeteries. So they are a little further behind the lines. But as far as danger is concerned, there is danger anywhere as far as the guns can fire. And of course, as the war goes on, the larger the guns get more and more accurate, they're able to fire further and further. And so 20 kilometers behind the lines, 20 miles behind the lines, you still have that danger of the random shell coming in. So it's not so much that they're aiming exactly at you, they're perhaps aiming at an area, a village or a town, a little bit like the firing at Amiens. When they were firing at Amiens very badly knocked about during the First World War, especially in 1918, when it really becomes in range of lots of guns. Then the damage is quite severe, but it's very random damage. Yes, the damage nearer to the German lines is heavier than it is further into the city, but it's very random. Nobody was aiming at any one building, perhaps other than the cathedral, which is very, very visible, and they very often would use a big building as an aiming point. So it's but by 1918, it's mainly map shooting. You have to say they're looking at a map, calculating from a map where they're trying to get the shells to. As the war went on, the field hospitals and stationary hospitals, which we haven't mentioned, a stationary hospital, like a field hospital, but a little bit more, it's permanent. It's very often in buildings rather than tented and hutted. Those hospitals on the coast were bombed as the German Gotha bombers changed their I suppose, target from trying to bomb England, because they had been bombing in 1917. They were bombing London. They then start bombing the coastal locations, anything that was lit up. And of course, something that tends to be lit up are field hospitals, great big red crosses on the top to try and keep the bombers away. But the problem was that the storage areas, the ammunition stores, the soldiers' rest centres, they're all close to the hospitals. They're intermingled. And so whether they were bombed on purpose or whether they were indirectly bombed because they were aiming at something else, I don't know. But certainly we know that nurses and drivers, female drivers, were killed by the bombing of the hospitals and areas behind the lines, ammunition dumps, etc. So again, it's something else that, again, didn't go and just touched upon it. Ammunition and the storage of ammunition, of course, massive amounts needed. So it has to be stored all over that area between us and the coast, between the front line and the coast.
Just another key part that is not really looked at, Pete, is the medical side of the First World War.
There's more and more research being done, and interestingly, you'll find it online. I can't remember who even did it, but there's a recent one, maybe Chris Baker, I think, but I'm not sure. But there's a fairly recent bit of work that's been done that shows is trying to identify all of those medical posts throughout, behind the lines, all the hospitals, the movements of them, where they went to, because they, again, like everything else, they tend to move around a bit. So the names change. So yeah, a lot of work being done on that in recent years as well, and it's ongoing. That work is ongoing, trying to pinpoint exactly where they are, and also to try and find some of the plans and maps and layouts of what these things look like, because it's something that it doesn't instantly, can't go online and say, I wonder what that hospital or complex looked like. But you slowly but surely that is developing. It's one of the great joys of the internet and passing of information and digitizing of information. That means it's becoming clearer the further away we get from the war, which helps immeasurably to historians like myself who are doing research on various aspects of the war.
Being behind the lines, Pete, wasn't a guarantee of safety. What are some of the things that could go wrong, and what stories do you have about some of the more serious ones that you've heard?
Right, so what could go wrong when you're behind the lines? Well, again, it depends on what you're doing. There are so many different things that were going on. So I suppose accidents involving weaponry, people being trained. And I just remember doing the research on the soldier. Can't remember his name off the top of my head, but doing a research on the soldier who had been killed in action. And yet, when I started doing the research, I thought, how on earth do you get killed in action here? It was miles and miles, 20, 30 kilometres behind the lines. And eventually managed to track down an account, and it was rifle grenade training, and somebody had fired a rifle grenade, and it went straight up in the air, and it came straight back down again. And it killed everybody who was in that area. About 6 guys killed from one rifle grenade. And so that's where he was killed, so classed as killed in action, but unfortunately it was actually an injury. Another simple one, I remember taking a family around, following in the footsteps of their relative, an Australian family, and their great uncle had been in the first Australian tunnelling company. And I thought, great, this is going to be interesting. And I thought, sad that he was killed, but there's going to be a great story here. Well, there wasn't, in a way. There was just a very sad story. He was on a motorbike behind the lines, and he slipped off his motorbike, and a lorry ran him over. Oh. So there it was, a tunnelling company officer, and killed on his motorbike. So there were lots of things that could kill you behind the lines. And you have to say, it's duplicating what went on in civilian life in some cases. Motorcycle accidents, people doing stupid things with weaponry, or not stupid things. So again, another horrible sad little story, and it's going back to something we just touched upon. Guys with PTSD, of course, don't always want to go any further. They just feel they can't go on. And I remember coming across an Australian soldier's grave in Naor, the place where these underground caves are, and going into the cemetery and find there's an Australian soldier buried in the cemetery. So I went to go and look him up, and he was a suicide. He shot himself. So sadly, that's another way that you'll find the graves of soldiers behind the lines. Bombing raids, as I said, that's obviously going to kill people behind the lines. Ammunition depot explosions, things like somebody having a fag behind the shed in the ammunition depot, and before he knows it, the whole lot goes up. Or a German bomber comes over and a freak bomb sets it off. So things like that. So lots and lots of ways. And then, of course, the enormous number of men that sadly died in that medical evacuation. They didn't get out of France, and they died on the medical evacuation. There is one other very, very sad case, and I'm sure more than one, but I remember it. And this was a leave boat crossing the Irish Sea. So it was soldiers who had relatives in Ireland, and they're sailing from wherever it was, Liverpool, I can't remember, but going across the Irish Sea to Ireland to go and see their relatives there, and it was torpedoed on the way. So they were killed miles behind the front, trying to get to Ireland as part of their leave, and killed when the ship was sunk. So yeah. And on we go, I suppose. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess too, Pete, there's, like anything, boredom is a big, apart from when you're getting shot at, there's a lot of boredom that can go with the army.
Yeah, and something we should have mentioned and we haven't, of course, is sport. So lots of sport going on behind the lines, and quite often it's comical sport. Again, not just your average game of football. 3-legged races, egg and spoon races. I know these things like sack races. I know they sound ridiculous, but all of these things were trying to bring in a bit of jollity to what was going on behind the lines when these soldiers were at rest. These are generally soldiers in that period when they came out the line and they were at rest. Also, what they had something to keep your morale up. Very often, units like to vie against each other. Not very often. Units always like to vie against each other. I mean, I'm an ex-Royal Marine, and we hate the parachute regiment, because we just do. It's just kind of it's as you join up, you automatically hate the parachute regiment, and vice versa. Only in a semi-jokey way, I suppose. And that went on throughout the whole of the First World War between units who would compete with each other. And things like, I remember my grandfather talking about this. He was in the 32nd Divisional Ammunition Column. Well, they would have competitions against other ammunition columns at who could have the cleanest, GS wagon, the General Service wagon with all the harness and the horses, absolutely gleaming. Everything spotless, and they would have competitions when they were behind the lines as who had the cleanest GS wagon and the most regimental GS wagon with its badges all on properly. And so another way of keeping the men occupied. So boredom was a big issue. So almost everything we've talked about from a pleasurable point of view behind the lines, that they were organised very often to keep the men occupied.
Retrospectively, Pete, I think they did a pretty good job. I think they trying to keep the men entertained. I think they did a good job.
I have to say, having served in the military, boredom is a big thing even now. In any military situation, keeping the men occupied when you're not in combat, which of course in the First World War they're not, as we said, a lot of the time they are behind the lines. Keeping the men occupied, you have two ways you can go. You can keep them doing training and military stuff over and over and over again, which helps. You have to say it keeps you occupied and very often will save their lives if they're being trained in weaponry and taking weaponry to bits in the dark or whatever with your eyes shut, things like that. But you have to balance that with sport and games and fun, which again they have to, because if you don't do it, they'll go and do it themselves, and it might not be quite what you want them to do, especially if it involves a lot of drink. So let's try and keep them occupied. I'm going to go off tangent completely. When the British Army was in India before the First World War and after the First World War, how on earth do you keep people who are garrisoning the empire in India? There was very often nothing going on. Sometimes there is, but very often nothing going on. They used to have gardening competitions in front of their huts. They would create gardens and see what plants they could grow. So you think, that sounds ridiculous. Sewing, tapestry work. They would create the most wonderful tapestries, very often used in the First World War as part of recuperation if you'd been wounded, both either mentally or physically, to do tapestries and sewing work. But done prior to the Great War, the British Army had a great tradition of doing tapestry work and gardening, something we would never think about, really.
Absolutely. That's just, and
Yeah.
Pete, well, the tangent's beautiful. I love your tangents. They're fantastic. So.
Good. Yeah.
So just to finish up, Pete, do you think there's been enough historical research about what occurred behind the lines? And if not, what more do you think could be done?
Question. You go into any bookshop that specialises in First World War books and you'll find lots and lots about the frontline experience of soldiers. But having said that, there is more and more work being done on the rear areas. There's been a lot of work in recent years about women in the rear areas because, of course, women did not come to the front line. No woman served right in the front line. The nearest you're going to get to it are the field hospitals, really, and sometimes outstations from the field hospitals. And in fact, the Nellie Spindler, the only woman that was killed by direct, only nurse that was killed by direct fire, she was with some Australian nurses at the same time as well, actually, just for the Australian listeners. And she was in an outpost close to the front and came under direct shell fire. But the majority of nurses and women that died in the First War, it's right in the rear areas. I can't remember what the question was, Adam. I've lost the question.
Just basic. I'll get it again for you, Pete. Hang on.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Do you think there's been enough historical research?
Right. Yeah, got it. Yeah. So the answer is, there's always room for more research, always room. And there are people researching all the time. And I think one of the hardest things nowadays, if you think, I can see an opening for a book, is you tend to find that somebody will beat you to it. So there's a lot of work being done on the rear areas, as there are lots of other aspects of the Great War. And I think it's a great thing, and it's going to continue as we learn more and more, because as more records come out, then it certainly is becoming a popular aspect of the war. I think a lot of people think we've written almost as much as we can about the fighting, so where do we go now? At the end there, we've just gone past the centenary of the end of the war, and of course it led to a whole load of new books coming out on soldiers returning home and their experience of returning home. So I think that's another aspect that's very interesting. Never mind the leave and what went on in their downtimes, but what happened to the soldiers when they went home. So again, I think as we hit the centenaries, then that's also led to a whole new lot of books about soldiers' experiences out of the front line, which I think has been great.
Absolutely, and I think, Pete, too, what's been good about, there's still so many things that we don't know, the unknowns of the Great War, and there's still great research going on today of new things, like you said, men after they finish the war going home, and that concept, and there's so many things that are going on in with the Great War that are still, even though it's 100 plus years now, it's still so fascinating to learn these new parts of history that have been forgotten.
Oh, it is, and I think one of the ones that I've found interesting, because I'm actually probably as much, if not more so, interested in that out of the front experience of the soldier. One of the things that I think has become interesting, just oddities. How many soldiers took the war home with them and became violent to their wives and to others. And there's been a lot of research on that, on how. It's something we've never really covered before. Is how did that affect the men when they went home? How many men did commit suicide when they went home? And it's very hard to figure it out because very often they're not marked down as suicides, or it's not recognised that they are suicides because of their Great War experience. It's seen as perhaps it's something else that was going on in their lives, but we now know that's not the case. So there's room for more and more research on every aspect almost of the Great War, and it goes on. A recent book, and I'm sorry to say it for the author, I can't remember who it is, but about the uniforms and the making of the uniforms. It's just about that, about the uniforms and how it was sourced and who did the research on the uniforms and who decided what was the best boots and who picked the webbing. And so there's just so much research going on so many different aspects of the war, and on it goes. So yeah, my library gets bigger every week.
Absolutely, and a project that you're doing, Pete, which I know about, is about the cemeteries with the names that you've got with that don't have Christian crosses, or they don't have just that sort of that work that you're doing is fascinating.
Exactly, because it takes you into places that you don't expect to go, and I think that's the whole idea of new research. Is that's where it should take you. It should take you into somewhere where you're thinking, I don't know if I've ever seen anything written about this, or I don't know if I know anything about it at all, and where can I learn about it? And of course, which then takes you to look for other archives and other sources of information, which very often uncovers another archive of information that's not been discovered before, and that then goes into the public domain, and on we go again. So it's good.
Absolutely. Well, Pete, it's been great to have you on and just delve into a topic that I feel sometimes is overlooked, and it probably shouldn't be overlooked, and give the listeners a better understanding of what was happening away from the fighting. So, Pete, it's been great, and we'll definitely get you back on the show again. So, Pete Smith, thank you very much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure, Adam, and I don't feel we've done justice to it. I think there's an awful lot more that research can be done, and I hope that some more books and people's even the stories of some of those that were working behind the lines become available, because it is fascinating. Pleasure, Adam. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Pete. And for those who also want to check out Pete's work, he has launched a podcast through the Living History channel, and it is called Battle Walks. And Pete does a virtual walk of the battlefields every week. Him and Matt McLaughlin, they do a fantastic job. So if you want to, also check out Pete's work on Battleworks on Living History. So thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/truebluehistory, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/truebluehistory, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.